The emergence of a carbon industry, with everything that entails, from carbon trading to working out how to create carbon credits to the total change in our energy system, that's going to constitute an investment opportunity far greater than the entire internet and tech boom and tech industry put together. It's going to be one of the biggest investment opportunities in our lifetimes and beyond. We're talking about a truly huge, multifaceted global industry. So rather than talk just about the risks of climate change, I'd like to talk about some of the opportunities. But being an economist, I'd like to focus on the high level and assume that you can fill in the details. Now, the operative word in all of this is global. Sure, we have to look in our own backyard, but let's not be myopic about this. I think one of the concerns that I've had is that so often we just look at a problem like this and we think Australia. This is not an Australian issue, it's a global issue. And the opportunities that we should be looking at are on a global basis. This is a chart from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change looking at stationary sources of carbon emission around the world. The bigger the circle, the bigger the emission. You know, these are the really easy targets in theory to address with climate change. They're mainly big power stations, but some of them are other things. Now, if we're going to get on top of the climate change issue, we have to virtually change every one of the small dots on that chart into a pinprick. And we're going to change every one of the big dots to at least a small dot. When you look at how many there are, that's a huge, huge task. But have a look more closely at that and you'll see that there are actually two dimensions to this particular problem of reducing emissions. You've got the developed nations and you've got China. Hold the thought of how many of those dots there are in particularly the United States and then how many there are in China. This is a chart of per capita emissions of greenhouse gases. And yes, we should hang our heads in shame, but in reality, we actually don't matter. Compare the US with Europe, the major European countries there, and I've highlighted Germany and France. And that tells us something really interesting. You can have a modern, developed economy and be producing half the greenhouse emissions that we are or the United States is. That's with today's technology. It says you don't actually need new technologies to make a really big impression. If the US could get its emissions down to European levels, that would mean a huge difference in the overall level of emissions in the world. And we're talking about old technologies. We're talking about replacing coal-fired power stations with gas-fired power stations. That reduces your emissions by about 60%. Replacing coal with nuclear, reducing emissions by over 90%. Renewables, and you reduce your emissions by almost 100. But there's also a really disturbing aspect to the chart up there. Look down the bottom there and you see I've highlighted China and India. China, massively below the developed world in per capita greenhouse emissions, but I think this year China will become the world's largest emitter in total. If it was to grow its emissions to the level of the European countries on a per capita basis, that would be a tripling of China's greenhouse gas emissions. So let's don't kid ourselves here. Whilst China is making efforts at the margins, what you have going on there is one of the greatest leap forwards in the world economy since the Industrial Revolution. That means we do need new technology, we need really good technology, and we need it very fast. As much as we might all want to believe in wind and solar, the reality is that the coal is the world's major energy source. It's dirty, it's polluting, and it's cheap and it's abundant. This is a chart of world coal use, just in terms of the proportion of world total consumption. Now let's add China into the picture. China is now the world's largest producer and consumer of coal. So what that says is if we as a world are going to do anything about climate change, we really have to do something about coal. So I think one of the most important things we have to do is avoid trying to pick winners. The important thing is to price carbon appropriately and the winners will pick themselves. Markets do work. And if carbon emissions are priced properly, all sorts of technologies can be expected to emerge. And we're going to need every single one of those. There's no single answer to this. There's a distinct possibility that we're only going to half do this job. We won't stop climate change. And then you've got to start to look at those parts of the world which are going to benefit most from it. Because some people will benefit from climate change. And two of the big winners, I think, are going to be Canada and Russia. Russia, because of its huge natural gas reserves right between Europe and China, but Canada and Russia because their growing seasons are going to lengthen dramatically as temperatures rise, and you'll actually find that agricultural wealth and forestry will become even bigger industries in those two countries. The old Green Movement slogan used to be, think global, act local. But when it comes to investment, what we have to do is think global and act global. The carbon market, with everything in it, as I said before, will be bigger than the internet and the tech industries combined. It will be a huge market, huge range of opportunities for us. And we shouldn't forget that most of those opportunities will not be in Australia, but they'll be in the 98% of the world beyond our borders.
No one person can stand up here in front of you and summarise the science of climate change from their own experience. This was realised about 20 years ago, that the rate at which publications were occurring was too fast for that, what used to be the process where someone within the science field would periodically do a review. For example, the Working Group 1 report that came out in February was about 1,000 pages, 1,200 pages, 750 authors, reviewed 6,000 peer-reviewed papers in the literature, only peer-reviewed papers, of which half had been published since the last report in 2001. No one can keep up with that. If you Google IPCC, you can find these reports in total, and you can find summaries of them. So if you're interested, I'd advise you to do that. So what's the current science saying both on the observations and the projections of climate change? This is a summary of what it's saying about the changing temperature of the planet. The top panel shows that it's warming. The second panel shows that sea level has risen by 20 centimetres, almost entirely simply due to warmer water expanding. And the third panel shows that we're starting to get less snow and ice around. And this shows the snow cover for the Northern Hemisphere in the last decade or so is showing some decrease. But some of you will have seen this slide. This is a picture of the ice extent in 2003 compared with where it was over the Arctic in 1979. This has decreased regularly, around about 3% per decade in aerial extent. Last decade it decreased 10%. The other ice sheet that's in this picture is Greenland. And here this ice sheet is so thick that and it's up on the land, so if it melted it would change sea level by 7 metres. So I don't know of anyone in the world that really wants that to happen. We don't know whether it's going to happen. So in summary, over the past century we've found that global temperatures have risen by about 0.7 degrees. The last 11 of the last 12 years have been ranked in the 12 warmest years in measured history. That's about 150 years. So we've had a very warm decade. Snow cover is decreased in almost all regions, especially in spring and summer. And the summer period is extended by 12.3 days. That's for the Northern Hemisphere, averaged over the last century. And as Tim's pointed out, the summer now in North Eurasia and North America is 1.5 months longer than it used to be. The warming is unequivocal, according to this report, and it's clear both in the temperature measurements in the atmosphere and the oceans, but also as the effects it's had on ocean expansion and the loss of ice. These pictures show the kind of warming anticipated through this and the next century. So the yellow line is what would have happened if we stopped the growth of concentration, that is, suddenly lowered the emissions at the year 2000. The red line is what would happen if we had a sort of business as usual going forward, and the green and blue lines are different scenarios, different ideas about how, as a global community, we might try to stabilise the concentration of these gases and therefore stabilise temperature over the next century. Each of these involves massive reductions of emissions, a huge revolution, as Tim referred to, in the way we actually deliver energy. 3 points. One is that if we don't mitigate the emissions, the world will continue to warm. The second thing is a very positive thing, that because of this inefficiency that exists within the current system, we have an opportunity to actually significantly slow down the rate of emissions in the next couple of decades through energy efficiency in a cost-effective way. And the third dot point, if you go to the last line, have showed actually the cost of massive reductions of CO2 emissions in the world and in the Australian community is about 0.1% of GDP per annum. It isn't going to send us back to the caves. It is in fact something we have to do, and it's not going to be that costly to do. So in conclusion, the science strongly reinforces the view that global warming is occurring, and it's primarily a result of human activities.
Graeme's obviously presented some very compelling scientific evidence with regards to climate change. My role on the panel today is to say, OK, well, given that backdrop, how would investors practically integrate this in the investment decision? We do believe you can develop investment frameworks so that you can effectively introduce consideration of these issues into your investment decision. This is really the sort of key summary of the framework that we've developed to assess climate change, covering things such as carbon emissions trading, physical impacts, other risks and opportunities that companies will have to face, and then finally you've got sort of two key investment themes that are emerging in their own right, environmental technologies, which is obviously alternative and renewable energies, and second of all, water. What I thought I'd do is focus on what we think are the two key ones, being carbon emissions trading and the other risks and opportunities. So with carbon emissions trading, there's really two key aspects to consider. The first one is that it'll put a price on carbon, obviously, and therefore it will firmly embed this price of carbon into company P&Ls and valuations. The second element of carbon emissions trading is it creates carbon as an asset class. And I think Tim summed that up very well at the start. I mean, this is going to be a huge asset class. With regards to the first point, the embedding of carbon into the valuation of companies, this is really going to happen in three ways. Firstly, we're going to see an increase in energy prices. The second thing is it's going to create a direct carbon liability for companies. On the other side of the coin, there is the potential for carbon credit origination opportunities for companies, which is potentially a source of revenue. Before we can be definitive in identifying winners or losers from a carbon emissions trading scheme, we need to know things such as auctioning versus selling of permits, compensation for various industries. But it was interesting that we were fortunate enough to have Dr. Martin Parkinson, who's the Deputy Secretary from the Department of Treasury Climate Group organisation that are actually putting together and designing the carbon trading scheme. And he actually said to us that actually showed us a time frame, the timetable they've put down going out to 2012. And he said in that time frame that the second quarter of next year is the point at which they'll make the decision as to which industries are going to be compensated versus which ones aren't. So I'd suggest that for investors trying to assess the winners or losers, that second quarter of next year is a key time frame to working out, which industries will be relatively more effective than others. So I might just flick forward to the second sort of key level of analysis in that five-tiered framework, which is other risks and opportunities. And really, this is sort of looking at things such as the broader issues that companies will need to face as climate change evolves. So it's things such as changes to consumer behaviour as they become, more preferable in terms of their preferences for green products. Can companies manage their energy usage better going forward? The regulatory risks if they're forced to reduce their energy consumption. Any supply chain issues that they may face as their supply chain is impacted by the broad range of climate change issues. Another important factor would be things such as can companies maintain the relevance of their brand and in fact build their brand valuation as the community develops its thinking on climate change? Also, can the company continue to attract, the best talent and the best employees as they too are cognizant of who they're working for and the issue of climate change that sort of underpins the background to all of this. So, in short, companies will have a wide range of issues that they need to manage. And importantly, I think sort of Tim mentioned this, there's both risks and opportunities, and certainly as investors we need to focus on the opportunities as much as the risks. So I guess the conclusion is that, once the information flow is there, and it is starting but it is slow, it is something that we can analyse as an industry. So it's certainly something which I guess all of us as investors, it's really incumbent on us to make sure that we do raise it with companies and get it as an issue on the agenda in terms of the ongoing feedback between markets and companies.
Obviously, energy itself is a rapidly growing commodity. The International Energy Agency predicts that by 2030, total world demand for electricity could increase by 60%. That's 4,800 gigawatts of new generation capacity required. China, Tim showed very graphically some of the China effects. China has in fact pledged to reduce emissions intensity. In other words, it's pledged to reduce by 40% between 2000 and 2020, so the next 13 years, the intensity of its greenhouse gas emissions. That means per unit of GDP. But even if it achieves that, and it may well not achieve that, even if it achieved that, it would still add the equivalent of another United States of America, the world's highest polluter, to global greenhouse gas emissions by that time, in that quite short time. So that means that basically, from my point of view, I think there will clearly be a huge demand for renewable energy in China and probably India. There will be a huge need for urgent and stronger action globally and in the developed world to convert to renewable energy. No one can actually judge what the pace of that need will be. Depends whether the political systems in the West fail, really, whether democracy fails is the biggest question mark. Other markets, I think, that are definitely going to be expanded as a result of climate change will be firstly water technology. By far the greatest means to achieve efficiency in water in Australia and worldwide is irrigation infrastructure. And today we have the means in irrigation infrastructure to massively reduce water wastage. Oil substitution and other technologies in the transport market, obviously, things like water or hydrogen cars and or electric hybrids, modernised rail freight in the infrastructure space, forestry options. It's calculated currently that for marginal land, that is for example, at €25 per tonne for CO2, if that was the ultimate price which was established, you could probably generate $800 or something like that per hectare, Australian dollars per hectare, by planting out on that land. Now that would be a very, very promising return if you could do that. The big risk there is that how and even if tree growing will be given significant carbon credit weighting, because there are some problems, as you may know. Creating registrable carbon credits of one sort or another is, I think, one of the surefire winners. So what we'll be focusing on is renewable energy, the creation of carbon credits, possibilities for large-scale water infrastructure, as I've said, and also clean coal possibilities. As you could see from the scale of the coal issue, cleaner coal has to be part of the solution. So that's all I wanted to say, except for one final thing, and to add to this, the voice about the cost. We know the cost of doing nothing could be catastrophic. The cost of doing something, now everyone's starting to talk about that same number, 0.1%. The price of oil has more than doubled in recent years, and we've got a global boom on our hands. So this is a manageable issue, but it's only manageable if we have political leadership. Thanks.
Andrew Wiley, Trustee Cbus. We've had nearly 5 years of presentations at the ASI and CMSF about these issues, yet we still don't seem to have very effective coverage of some basic measures. Are we all reacting too slowly to this? The sense of urgency doesn't seem to be there if we look at some of the concrete measures and actions that have been on the table for the last 5 years. Are we dropping the ball?
I think you've been a bit unfair there, Andrew, in that I think it was a year and a half ago that Graeme and I were on the platform at CMSF talking about climate change, and at that stage our industry really hadn't thought about it that much. Since then, Australian super funds have been the largest, we've had the largest proportional take-up of the PRI, and the PRI itself was done by James Gifford, who's here, is actually an Australian, so we can claim it as an Australian invention. And I think that things are happening very, very quickly in super fund land, but obviously there are, always going to be holdouts. But this is a very long-term problem, and we're not going to solve it overnight. And just by a whole lot of us signing up to the PRI won't solve it. But certainly, I think that Australian super funds, by and large, have been amongst the most active in the world in this area. And hopefully that will continue.
Peter Johnston from Macquarie. We've talked a bit about, I suppose, responses, and we've talked a bit about companies and how they're going to react. We've talked a bit about projects and developments and things like that. The key issue that I think Tim touched on seems to be technology. Where is R&D spending across the board in terms of these technologies? Where is it coming from? We're talking more reactionary rather than
we seem to be sort of playing catch-up rather than actually try to get to the end game and finding the right sort of technologies. Is it being government funded? Are there private cells or private groups, or is industry funding it? I mean, how is that sort of being originated at the moment?
The current federal government's proposal was to actually have a $500 million fund to pick winners from amongst applicants for technology grants, where those applicants would match it. So they've been focused on grants really around the coal industry and so on. Technology focused on proving up certain technologies. And a number of things have missed out. The geothermal thing missed out, for example. But a number of coal technologies have got some funding. The key thing, however, is if we have an approach to this whole question that says we're going to proceed at a pace, and so we'll have generous permits issued under trading and so on, because the pace we're going to proceed at is the pace that allows the coal industry and the energy industry to adapt without impact on it, then we've lost. I think that's the key thing. So while the economy as a whole can adapt quite painlessly, it is probably true that certain industries have to move much faster than they do. So if they want to survive, they need to invest much more rapidly in R&D.
On a worldwide scale, you've got a whole range of things. You've got some governments elsewhere in the world who have been incredibly supportive of research. You've got some companies that are dedicating huge amounts of monies to research, and it's not just in power generation, but Toyota with its hybrid cars, which is in transport. Mobile transport is a very important carbon use. You've got a whole range of things. If we look at our own country, though, our priorities are pathetic. But that $500 million is over a long period of time. It's just, it's a token. And if Greenland really did start to melt, then you'd see tens of billions of dollars a year being spent on trying to find technological fixes. It's far better to do it now than then.
Grant Belchamber from Telstra Super. A clarification, really. Graeme and Garry, I think, said that the cost of mitigation is 0.1% a year. If the Australian economy grows at 3% a year, GDP will double by 2030. And if it grows at 2.9% a year, GDP will double by 2031. Is this really the catastrophic economic consequence of doing something that...
No, you put your finger right on it. It simply means that reaching a certain level of wealth is delayed by a few months over that period of time. It is not important. What we're getting is the story of a very extreme projection from ABARE in Canberra that's been picked up by Canberra to really make the point that somehow or other we're going to go back into the caves if we change our current energy system. And it isn't true. All of these analyses show that that isn't the case.
What we have to keep in mind, however, is that Australia, also because it is small, it is world dependent. And how Australia thinks it can have any influence in international fora, how it thinks it can bargain for free trade or other trade arrangements in international fora in an environment where it's seen as the highest per capita polluter in the world is beyond me. So while it's true that the direct impact on carbon from Australia can't be huge, it's the consequences of Australia not taking a leadership position could be absolutely disastrous.